Investigation of stroke triggered by SBP spike, on top of cerebral vascular calcification damage, number 1490, VPT Sharp 051, January 2, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category, Stroke. Preface. Through my research, I identified that my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025 resulted from long-term cerebral microvessel calcification, and was triggered by an acute systolic blood pressure, SBP, spike. Approximately 91% of my vascular damage was caused by poorly controlled diabetes, during a prior 20-year period from 1990 to 2009, with the remaining 9% accumulated during the more recent 16-year period from 2010 to 2025. These diabetes-related calcifications of cerebral microvessel walls represent largely irreversible structural damage. Around noon on June 21, 2025, my SBP suddenly reached 175 mm of mercury, as a result of a dispute related to a real estate investment. This acute hypertension event acted as the immediate trigger for vessel rupture. In the pontine region, starting on August 2, 2025, I began measuring my blood pressure at both the upper arm and wrist on the left and right sides, collecting a total of 12,240 blood pressure data points. This dataset includes 5 biomarkers: SBP, DBP, heart rate, HR, pulse pressure, PP, and mean arterial pressure. MAP, measured approximately 16 times per day. My primary focus was SBP, particularly values above 130 and 140 mm of mercury, while I also monitored DBP, PP, and MAP. I did not emphasize them with the same intensity, because my vascular stiffness was already a known and largely irreversible condition. Therefore, I must avoid any acute SBP event that could trigger another, potentially deadly stroke in the future. Accordingly, this study focuses specifically on acute hypertension, especially SBP spike amplitude, defined as the difference between maximum SBP and averaged SBP. Introduction. In this study, I selected the daily maximum SBP as the output strain. 3 input stressors were defined. 1. SBP spike amplitude, maximum SBP minus averaged SBP. 2. Averaged SBP. 3. Averaged pulse pressure, PP, is SBP minus DBP, as a proxy for vessel stiffness. Both fluid VMT and solid VMT frameworks were applied to analyze viscoplastic energy accumulation. The same dataset was also analyzed using topological data analysis TDA to examine geometric structure change and data connectivity, to reduce noise and emphasize physiological trends. The daily data were averaged into weekly bins. This resulted in 153 days of observations summarized into 22 consecutive weeks. Fluid VMT is used to describe the long-term metabolic damage from diabetes that accumulated and led to progressive cerebral microvessel calcification, which reduced the structural safety margin. Solid VMT is then used to describe the final mechanical failure event, in which an acute SBP spike exceeded the remaining vessel tolerance and triggered my hemorrhagic stroke. VMT analysis and results. The following normalization factors were used for the 3 input stressors. 1. Averaged SBP, 120 mm of mercury. 2. Pulse pressure, PP, 45 mm of mercury. 3. SBP spike amplitude, 12 mm of mercury and 15 mm of mercury, calculated separately. The VMT energy contribution ratios to the output strain. Maximum SBP were as follows. A. Using 12 mm of mercury normalization for SBP spike. SBP spike, 66%. PP, 18%. Averaged SBP, 17%. B. Using 15 mm of mercury normalization for SBP spike. SBP spike, 61%. PP, 20%. Averaged SBP, 19%. The difference between using 12 mm of mercury and 15 mm of mercury normalization factors resulted in only a 5% change in SBP spike contribution, and approximately 2% changes for PP and averaged SBP. These differences are negligible, and the overall energy distribution pattern remains consistent. This confirms that SBP spike amplitude is the dominant stressor, regardless of reasonable normalization choices. Pathophysiological interpretation. The physiological reasoning behind SBP spike amplitude being the strongest stressor is direct and mechanical. Stroke rupture is an acute event. Vessel rupture occurs when instantaneous wall stress exceeds structural strength. This depends on peak blood pressure, not averaged blood pressure. Diabetes and aging weaken vessel walls. Chronic metabolic damage and calcification reduce the safety margin. They create vulnerability but do not directly cause rupture. SBP spike, acute hypertension at 175 mm of mercury, is the trigger. A sudden SBP surge creates a rapid, tensile load that stiffened vessels cannot adapt to in time. This is the immediate mechanical cause of vessel rupture. Averaged SBP represents a background load. It raises baseline stress but rarely causes rupture by itself. Pulse pressure sets vulnerability, not timing. PP reflects vascular stiffness and fragility, but cannot predict when rupture occurs. The observed low correlation range of 22% to 56% between the strain of highest SBP and the 3 selected input stressors further supports this role separation. The cumulative VMT energy curve. The cumulative VMT energy curve represents the total irreversible vascular damage accumulated over the 22-week observation period. Unlike instantaneous blood pressure values, this curve reflects the full history of mechanical loading, including both steady background stress and transient overload events. Several key features of this curve are important. First, the curve rises monotonically over time. This confirms that vascular damage is cumulative and non-recoverable. Even when weekly blood pressure values appear acceptable, previously accumulated damage remains. Second, the slope of the curve is not constant. Periods with steeper increases correspond to weeks with higher SBP spikes, or repeated transient overloads. These weeks contribute disproportionately to total damage, even if averaged SBP remains controlled. Third, short plateaus do not represent recovery. They only indicate weeks with relatively lower incremental damage. VMT energy does not decrease because viscoplastic deformation is irreversible. Fourth, the final approach toward 100%. Cumulative energy indicates that the system has experienced repeated excursions near its tolerance limit. This explains why a single acute SBP spike can trigger rupture once sufficient. Cumulative damage has already accumulated. From an engineering perspective, this curve is analogous to metal fatigue under repeated loading. Each stress cycle leaves a small amount of permanent damage. Eventually, one additional load exceeds the remaining structural margin and causes failure. In biological terms, stroke risk is determined not by one bad day alone, but by the entire loading history of the vascular system. VMT analysis observation. In one sentence, chronic stiffness and elevated baseline pressure weaken vessels, but transient SBP spike amplitudes are the direct trigger of cerebral vascular rupture. Topological data analysis, TDA, of weekly blood pressure dynamics. In addition to VMT energy modeling, this study applies topological data analysis, TDA, to examine the geometric structure of weekly blood pressure states derived solely from my own measurements. The dataset consists of 22 consecutive weekly observations. Each week is represented as one point in a 4-dimensional state space defined by maximum SBP, output, SBP spike amplitude, input 1, pulse pressure, input 2, averaged SBP, input 3. TDA is well suited for this type of analysis because it does not rely on population averages, predefined thresholds, or linear correlations. Instead, it examines how physiological states are geometrically organized and how they evolve over time. In this framework, disease progression is viewed as movement through state space, rather than isolated numerical values. TDA analysis results in interpretation. When the weekly blood pressure states are embedded into multidimensional space, the points do not appear randomly scattered. Instead, they form a coherent geometric structure with a dominant trajectory. Most weeks cluster within a relatively compact region, representing a stable operating regime of blood pressure control. These weeks share similar combinations of averaged SBP, pulse pressure, and moderate SBP spike amplitudes. Several weeks deviate farther from this central cluster. These geometrically distant points correspond to weeks with larger SBP spike amplitudes and higher maximum SBP values. Importantly, these departures are driven primarily by transient SBP spikes, rather than by changes in averaged SBP or pulse pressure. From a topological perspective, the central cluster represents a baseline physiological regime. Departures from the cluster represent transient stress excursions. Geometric distance reflects combined deviation across multiple blood pressure variables. These excursions are temporary in time but significant in mechanical impact. TDA figure explanation. The 3D scatter shows weekly blood pressure states, with deviations from the core, driven mainly by SBP spike amplitude rather than average pressure. The radar chart confirms SBP spike as the dominant stressor, compared with averaged SBP and pulse pressure. Integrated interpretation of TDA and VMT. TDA and VMT provide complementary perspectives on the same physiological process. TDA shows how weekly blood pressure states move through physiological state space over time, while VMT quantifies the irreversible vascular damage accumulated along that path. Weeks with larger SBP spike amplitudes lie farther from the stable core of blood pressure states, whereas averaged SBP and pulse pressure mainly define background conditions. Together, these findings show that stroke risk is driven not by average blood pressure alone, but by episodic SBP spikes acting on an already structurally weakened vascular system. Conclusion: my stroke was not a random event. It was the predictable outcome of long-term vascular damage, combined with a single acute mechanical trigger. This study demonstrates that controlling average blood pressure alone is insufficient. Preventing future strokes requires suppressing sudden SBP spikes that exceed vascular tolerance, especially in individuals with existing vascular calcification. Disclaimer: I write this article not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand health, prevent disease, and live better lives. This content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this article freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights belong to the author. Gerald C.